Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us to the Progressive Web Apps, the Ins and Outs chat with Dave Robinson. I am Paul Mahal, and I'm a software developer at Dispatch, and I'm actually really looking forward to this chat. I want to ask everyone if you have any questions throughout the session to feel free to add them to the chat, but we will be addressing them at the end of the session, so you can also save it for then. And as well, this theme is sponsored by Roof, ROOF, and a huge thank you to them for their support of Startup Slam. You can connect with them and learn more about them at any point today before 1 p.m. in their virtual booth in the expo section over there. So Dave has worked as a senior developer for the last 10 years, working on legacy applications and services and designing a number of new platforms from scratch. His motto is challenge, 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 and no true innovation comes from just going with the flow. If you want to chat with him after the talk, you can find him on Twitter at ARRRDave. Without further ado, I pass the mic off.
Okay, everybody. I'm not able to hear Paul, so it's going to be a little bit interesting if he needs to tell me anything, but we're going to go. Just so you know, I have a screen here and a screen here, so if I'm looking off into space, that's because I am. But anyway, let's get started. We're going to be talking today about progressive web apps. For me, it's a really exciting new technology, and it's part of it's new and part of it's not new. The web apps part is not really new, but the progressive part is, and is gaining a lot more traction than previous attempts at it. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. So the what, why, and how, that's what we're going to be doing out. We're going to be talking about what is a progressive web app. Why would you bother with a progressive web app? That's probably one of the most important questions right now. And of course, how. So, not, and away we go. We are going to save questions for the end in case Paul didn't mention that. So before you can talk about a progressive web app, let's just make sure we're on the same page with what is a web app anyway. So a web app is a software application, not a website, but a software application built using web technologies. So HTML, CSS, JavaScript are the core technologies, with various other technologies that you can use, kind of take advantage of those technologies. There's a couple ways you can do a web app. So my personal favorite is a single page app. It doesn't have to be. You can do multi-pages and reload and load as you will. But I prefer a single page app because it more closely mirrors what a typical web app or app structure is. So, well then, what makes a web app progressive? My favorite part, it doesn't need the internet. Mind-blowing, right? It's a web app. That makes no sense. Of course it needs the internet. There's a lot more to it, but the not needing the internet part really is what establishes it as a progressive web app. I mean, it working in the web is great, but really it's more web app. So the ability for a web app to function online really is the biggest part for me that makes it progressive. But there is more. The full story is really a progressive web app is an app that is capable of filling in for or completely replacing a native app. So you have Slack as an example. So you can get a desktop app for Slack, or you can get a mobile app for Slack. But there's also a web browser. I'm using it right now to chat with Paul when needed, and it completely replaces Slack for mobile and Slack for desktop. So in a way, that is a progressive app. A progressive app doesn't necessarily need to work offline, but it is a web, and there are things that it may built into it that actually make it progressive. So when we're talking about progressive web app on a mobile device, this really the kind of big deal. You can actually install it on your mobile device and give it an icon on your home screen. I've actually seen Chrome on Android. You can actually install the icon in your app tray, so it's not just limited to kind of desktop shortcut. It actually feels like an app on the device. Firefox isn't there yet, but it has the same functionality. But it really is kind of the push for progressive web apps is treating it the same as a native app, not treating it as a second-class citizen or an app, but actually saying, hold on, no, this can serve the same purpose. So you see the second bullet here. It does not have to work offline if you don't want it to, but but the other big one is access to hardware. I mean, there's lots of access to hardware in the browser than maybe people realize. You can get full access to the camera, microphone. I haven't played with the accelerometer myself for it. GPS has been because I've been doing GPS in browsers on mobile for 7 years now. And so that's a pretty mature technology. And then one of the more less supported, but hopefully getting better, is device storage. I mean, when you've got an app to store information, whether it be in a database, videos or images or whatnot, you need space to store it. In the days, we only had cookies, and then we had local storage. Really, that's just not enough. Device storage, which is going to just make progressive web apps that much better. And the exciting one that really brings it in parallel with the native app is the ability to push notifications. More on that later. So what makes a progressive web app cool? Okay, I already kind of touched on a few things, but let's hit some bullets that are kind of the highlights. So what makes a web app cool is really the platform compatibility. I mean, it's going to work on any device pretty much everywhere. I mean, you will have a tough time finding a mainstream hardware platform that does not support web browsers. I mean, even e-readers have have web browsers built into them. And so that's a really big deal. You build your app once and it works everywhere. You don't have to build an Apple version. You don't have to build a Windows version. You don't have to build an Android version, and on and on and on. You can just build it once and you're done. So that's the big benefit from a cost and effort standpoint. It's a common technology. So JavaScript, HTML, CSS, you'd be hard-pressed to find a developer that hasn't had some exposure to those technologies. So it's really easy to hire new people to work on these things. It's easy to get up to speed because you're probably, as a developer, already familiar with them. So adopting a progressive web app is really quite easy. I see there's a little bit of chat there. I'm just going to be answering questions at the end just so we can keep things moving along. I have quite a few slides, so happy to stay on late to answer all your questions at the end. The neat thing too with the browser, free development tools. You don't have to buy a fancy IDE or license one. You can use all your console and debugging tools right within the web browser, and it's all free. And text editing has been free for decades, so real low cost of adoption, which is great, and very easy distribution deployment. It's very easy to get a web app out there. Progressive really just takes what makes a web app great and makes it better. So you have an improved user experience because now you can actually have an icon on your desktop. You can have some caching, which we'll talk about later, which gives better performance, and broader applications because now you're not limited to, I need to be online all the time. Now you can do pretty much anything. But of course, there are potential downsides that we need to talk about. And let's talk about one here is that a progressive web app is kind of an unknown quantity, which is why this session is kind of exciting for me, is to talk about a technology I really like. But it is not that well known, and it's not also understood that well by clients as well. So you had a development team that made this great app, you still have to educate your client on how to install it and how to use it, and may not be as easy in all situations. It is more challenging again to less well known how to do it. JavaScript support workers, pretty cross browser, so multitasking isn't that big of a deal, but it's something that is less well known. So just put it in there for that. Hardware optimization, that's really difficult. You're kind of trapped within the browser. You can't command the OS to perform the way you want it to. You kind of have to work with what the browser is giving you. So that's a bit of a bummer, depending on your app, of course. And of course, not full access to the hardware. It's getting there, but still work to do. We have to be careful with web apps because of the privacy and security that is inherent in browsers. So browser manufacturers are taking their time and being a bit careful with that. But the real big gotcha is that it's not mature. There are some features that work great, and I've bit to prepare for this session, but also before. And some things work great, and some things not as well, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So if this technology is looking at now, well, if you've ever heard of a Chromebook, you know that it's true. ChromeOS is a Linux Chromium operating system. It basically boots you to your browser. You can install web pages like apps. You don't even need to make them progressive. You simply, instead of a bookmark, it becomes an icon in your taskbar or menus or whatever. Real easy to do. A progressive web app is that much better for a Chromebook because now you don't have to have internet. I know Chromebook's designed mostly for always having internet, but there's been a big push, especially with the addition of Android apps onto Chromebooks, to make them the ability to work offline. If you're in the education market, Chromebooks are awesome. They are everywhere. They're so low cost and they are durable and a great battery life that they are just a big go-to. Okay, I'm just getting a signal that my share just stopped. Hold on. Okay, we're back. Looks like we're back. Paul, tell me if we're not back. Okay, so yeah, like I was saying, if you're in the education markets, a progressive web app is a really, really great option for you right now. The how common Chromebooks are in education, but not that long ago, a month or so ago, the big press release about Microsoft and Google kind of working together to promote progressive web app development and support. Not really clear from the press release what that means, but at the very least it means that there's some heavy players that are putting some big effort into it. And honestly, Microsoft has probably been leading the charge in a lot of ways because Office has been available in web versions for years. I personally prefer the web version of a number of the Office, and have been willing to live with the other ones that are not as polished, but definitely some big behind this technology. So what are we actually going to talk about? We are going to talk about, we're not going to talk about how to build a web app. That's not what we're talking about here. We're going to talk about how to make a web app progressive, because that's what really matters. I mean, you can Google 1,001 ways to make a web app, but progressive web apps is what we're talking about here. Let's give you a bit of background, because your Googling may find things that will lead you astray. There was once a thing called app cache, application cache. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't good. It was a little clunky. You basically put a little text in your HTML tag there saying, hey, these are the files that I want to cache. These are the ones I don't want to cache. These are the ones that you go to if you don't have a problem. or if you find a problem. So it was the first real attempt to make apps work offline. I had some success with this technology and was a little upset when it got the deprecated flag on it, because it took a long time to get working for me. But there were problems with it, and so I'm kind of happy now that I've kind of moved past that. So the biggest problem with App Cache is that it was server side, less control over it. You're updating all your apps, all your files all the time. You can't anywhere anyway, and if you made a mistake, it was very bad. Lots of headaches with cache just for the browser, unable to free it from there, and crashing does nothing. Very, very frustrating. So where are we at now? Let's introduce service workers. So the replacement for application cache. They are JavaScript based, so very dynamic in nature. Lots of opportunities to try this or whatever you want to do. Do not confuse them with web workers, which is asking in JavaScript. They are very similar to web workers, where they have a similar scope or separate thread from the user interface, but they are not the same. You have extremely fine-tuned control over how you want to cache things, and it's actually taken off really, really well. If you just go into your browser, and I'll show you later, and see what workers are installed, you probably see most news sites have them, most blog sites have them. So it's definitely getting good adoption, which is great. So how does it work? So normally you have a user request and the browser forwards it straight to the internet. But now when it detects that a service worker is in place for that site, the service worker takes over. The service worker will take a look at your request. It will check its caches to see if it has a match. If it has a cache, it will serve the cache instead of the internet. If it does not, it will fetch it. And you can control this because you can design, the service worker however you want. So it allows you to build an app and build a service worker independently, and potentially not ever have two cross over, and it'll work. All of a sudden your web app is offline capable and it can handle push notifications, all sorts of stuff. So it's really kind of nice way where you can just put it in there and away you go. So if you have an existing web app, upgrading it will not be difficult. It's nuts and bolts. This is a service worker, really. Forgive the grainy look of my copy and paste, but anyway, the idea is you can see add event listeners to a service worker. I'm not too jazzed with self as the keyword. I would have preferred this or whatever, but reserved keyword for service workers is self. We have here that says fetch. So whenever a fetch comes in, and this the new fetch API, but will interest XHR requests as well. So any external requests through JavaScript or actually simple page loading will come through the service worker. So even if you just load a static image or HTML file or something like that, it will come through the service worker. And then you can see how we are searching our Am I back? Paul, give me a message if I'm back. Awesome. Okay. Having fun with the tech today. All right. Well, it is what it is. Okay. So we know here that if we have a response in the promise function, that turning off your webcam bandwidth issue. Oh yeah. I mean, you guys don't need to see me, do you? Okay. Can you still hear me, Paul? Give me a... Everyone can hear me? All right, okay. Awesome, we'll continue. All right, so, and mindful of time here, it looks like we still do have a bit of time, so we can move along. All right, cool. Yeah, so cache response, if we have a response from the caches.match, we can serve that. You can, of course, add more code here if you want to choose different conditions for it, but you can see that in this example, we're logging a yes, we responded with a cache, or no, we fetched the response for it instead. You could have it here that it automatically adds to the cache whenever there's a response, but that may run into troubles if you are working with APIs, etc. So this is a very simple example of just how to deal with that. Okay, sorry. All right, service worker caches. So very important. This is the thing that powers the offline functionality. So there's no limit to the number of caches you can have, but there is a storage limit, and there is an API to help you kind of manage that. The storage limit, varies from browser to browser, so you don't have to worry if you're going to be under probably 5 megabytes. That's usually been the number, but you get a lot more. If your app's going to require a lot more storage, take advantage of the storage API. So there is a caches object. So you saw caches.match earlier. The caches object is, and again, not a great keyword. It would have been nice if you had to do a self.caches or this.caches or something. So it's a little confusing when you're looking at code because it just looks like any old variable. So a little annoying there, but anyway, so you add caches as a URL if you want, or you can actually create your own request objects and add them that way. The corresponding resource is then fetched at it, but you can also provide it as well. This is maybe deleted from a cache as well, and this is kind of one of the strategies that I use when maintaining cache. I think the way it was kind of intended was when you had an update to your app, you create a new cache, and then you just the old one, and then carry on. For me, I found it a little bit easier to actually use a single cache and add and delete resources from that cache as change detected. You can't just shove in a new URL or a URL and have it update an existing. You need to actually delete it from a cache before you can, before it will take hold. So I think I do have some gotchas coming up that we'll talk about that again. So why do we cache? This is probably self-explanatory for many people. Offline functionality in this case, faster page loads for visitors. So subsequent page loads is a key word there. Obviously the first one takes a bit of time, but you can kind of control that depending how you want things to load. You can cache for managed version control. So this is kind of nice if you wanted to give your clients some really good control about when they update and then giving them the ability to roll back even. So, a lot of big enterprise companies, they will be very strict about testing new releases before they're allowed to go into production. So this way you can actually have multiple caches in your app, and you could actually give the user control over that if you wanted to. And really, you cache to give a better overall user experience for your clients. All right, some gotchas. Just because you've updated the cache doesn't mean your app is using it. You must reload it. So what happens is if you have your client page and then your cache changes and it downloads a new resource, your client page is still using the old version. You'll need to reload the page in order for that new asset to be used. Before, you can't just update a resource in your cache, delete it, and then add it again. That got me for sure. Caching external resources. Yeah, you got to be a little careful about. You definitely will want this ability, especially if you're using fonts hosted by Google or whatnot. Fonts seem to be pretty good in that you need to have the cores enabled on the remote resource. So like an image off of some page, probably you won't be able to cache that, but a font is kind of be designed to be externally accessible will probably have cores enabled on. just be a little careful with your external resources. You must make sure those appropriate headers are there. I won't go into more detail on that. It's out of scope. So the service worker caches URLs in a relative fashion. So the location of your service worker does matter. You must make sure that when you are passing a relative URL to your cache, its location is relative to the service worker. If you have your service worker in a subfolder, then you need to make sure you're appropriately setting your path. We'll talk a bit more about that later. All right, installing the service worker. Okay, so this is the client app. This is how you actually get a service worker installed. So in this case, we are just calling it serviceworker.js. So it's in the root of our application, or at least the root that the client code thinks it is in. In this case, I had a dynamic scope. Now, scope's a bit important. You can omit this value if you want. The scope tells the browser when to use service worker. So anything the root of URL that you pass into scope, the service worker will be activated for. So if you put a service worker subfolder and omit the scope, it will not work, because it will the browser will only activate your service worker for that subfolder, which you probably have nothing else in. If I didn't mention it already, service workers work very much on promises, so make sure you understand promises before you attempt to use service workers. So yeah, basically you get a call back if you're successful in the service worker, and you get a registration value as well, which has some useful things in it, which we'll talk about later. You can communicate with the service worker, just like a web worker. You can do it. It's kind of interesting, the relationship. The client can kind of control how it is controlled by the service worker. Kind of confusing, because the service worker really has ultimate control over what the app gets, but the app can, on initial load, kind of control that as well by saying in the previous slide there, I want this particular service worker working for me, or whatnot. You can also send messages to it, and so at the top here we have the code needed to receive a message from the service worker. This one is code for actually sending a message to the service worker in the app. By the way, I'm going to make this slideshow available right away after this presentation, if you want it. And I believe Slam's going to post these as a session online later, but just in case you can't copy and paste from that, you'll be able to copy and paste from this, except for my bad images. Sorry. Communicating with the client, the service worker, we've got receiving code at the top, sending code at the bottom. A little gotcha with the sending code that is interesting. Let's say you have multiple windows in the browser app open. Those all represent as different clients to your service worker, but the service worker is still just the service worker. So you actually can send a message specifically to a single window if you wanted, but that's actually not true. That functionality is still in development by the browsers. We'll talk about that in gotchas a little bit later. So currently, you have to send a message to all your clients. This isn't really a big deal. You know, as long as your client is set up to accept these messages, then it's not really a big deal. It'll work just fine. So this might be useful if you wanted to tell the client, for example, that there's new code and it needs to refresh. This functionality would be really useful. Maintaining the service worker, super, super important. Also very easy to mess up, even if it is working properly by the browser, which seems to be very well supported. Browser is, or the service worker is auto-maintained by the browser. You can control it, and we'll talk about it a little bit, but for the most part, 24 hours, not every 24 hours. When the page is loaded, 24 hours has passed, then the browser will download the new service worker. It will not use it immediately. You can't refresh the page. The new service worker will take effect when no resources in scope for the service worker are in use. So that means images, JavaScript, HTML, anything that's in scope that the service worker is in scope for, it will not use a new one until those are all stop being used. So you actually need to close the page if you're doing it in a web browser, or close the app if you've installed it before the new service worker will take over. This does seem to be working well in the browsers. In general, service worker stuff for caches and maintenance of the service worker is working really well. So you can be good in using that. The client can trigger an update. I haven't used this myself. It's in the specs, so it may work. But yeah, with anything with progressive web apps, test, test, test. About the service worker, this is a Firefox example. If you go about service workers in the URL, it will give you a long list of all the service workers you have installed. You probably have quite a bit more than you expected, and this would be one of them. This is from my website, just a simple notes app used for myself for proof of concept and convenience. Anyway, so this isn't terribly useful from a developer perspective. It some information, but there's another one a bit more interesting that we'll talk about later. Notice at the bottom we have update and unregister. Unregister I usually find more useful because then a single repage load will start everything up again. But you can try update, you just have to make sure of the scope thing that I talked about. Right above that is push endpoint. That will tell you whether your service worker is handling push notifications, which hopefully we'll have time to get to in a little bit. Lots of time, so I feel like we'll be able to get through everything. All right, so again, another Firefox example. If you go about debugging instead, this is where you get a lot more interesting stuff with regards to the service worker. You'll get this kind of funny window. Click on this Firefox. Otherwise, you can plug in a device to USB and debug it. But if you're just on the desktop, go this Firefox, and then it'll show you a list of service workers. Now, a service worker may not be running. The browser will turn off. This is really good for mobile devices or laptops. You don't want these service workers running all the time and draining your battery. So the browser is very meticulous about turning them off. It's not really a big deal. It doesn't affect performance for you in any ways, but it does affect whether you can debug it or not, which is the next one here. So on that last screen, there was a start button where you can start the service worker, and then the menu will change to this where you can now inspect it. You could unregister on the previous page. But there's also a push button here, which is how you can send a push notification event to the service worker. That is really great for testing your push notification functionality without having a server doing all the handshaking and stuff like that, which we'll talk about a bit more. Serving the service worker, right? So you need to put it somewhere on your server, and unfortunately you can't just put it there and it works. It has to have this service worker allowed HTTP header. If you are not going to serve it from the root of your app, you must make sure that you're setting the scope on the client when you are installing it. In that code example I gave earlier, it was detecting the path of the current web page and was using that for the scope. So that's probably the safest way to do it rather than manually typing in a URL. And again, remember the URL cache path is relative to the service worker. So even if your scope is set correctly, you must make sure you are caching your paths correctly. So this service worker allowed header is annoying because it's a little bit more difficult to, depending on what kind of server access you have, and even if you have full server access, it's a little bit annoying to do that with just JavaScript files because you don't want them all installed with that. So I actually use a PHP file on my personal server for doing this, and there's the URL for, I gave you a fun example. Anyway, the PHP way of doing this, all it does is it echoes out the contents of the JavaScript file and pretends to the that it is a JavaScript file, but it's great because you can add the service worker allowed header and the appropriate scope on it as well. So that's one way you can kind of cheat. And if you saw in, I don't know, example, but you don't have to even say PHP. You could say like index PHP and then just have it as a absolute path without the file, and it will just load it. And anyway, this works fine in all the browsers I've tested on. There are some warnings in the spec about using non-JavaScript files, but as long as your headers are set correctly, there seems to be good support for this technique. Okay, this is a very important page in case you get stuck. I got stuck many, many times, and so hopefully this page will help you not be stuck. Make sure service workers are enabled. Pretty much they always are, but if it's just not working for you, we'll check. Not all browsers are developer friendly. You can get stuff in cache. It's very frustrating. Unwrapping the service worker usually works. Closing the browser sometimes helps as well if you're really stuck, but it may not actually be or the browser. It may actually be your server caching the content. This problem with Nginx, it was caching my static resources, and you're changing them frequently. It doesn't always pick up the changes immediately. So make sure your server is not caching resources. There's a couple of ways you can do this. I turned off caching on Nginx, and that kind of solved the problem. But you may also, to prevent your browser caching, you may want to add a bunch of no cache headers to all of your files that are part of the app. The service worker ignores stuff and can cache regardless of whether the headers say no cache or not. So telling your browser to cache a static resource is a great idea, because sometimes the browsers get confused and they will cache static assets. This absolutely killed me on one of my projects. I had to purge, which is what I put at the bottom here. Clear all your history, clear all your cache files, everything, you'll eventually get it out. But if you can set your headers right, you won't have that suffer. You must serve your service worker HTTPS. Localhost does work for local development. If you're doing external resources, the cross-origin request stuff. That's not the acronym, the stuff part, but you get it. And server workers will not install if they contain syntax errors. This is kind of an annoying thing. Normally, if you have a syntax error in the Java, the browser will happily tell you which line it's on or whatever. You can use a lint tool or whatever to double check your JavaScript. But if you're just using the browser, what you can do is create a dummy HTML page that is outside of service worker scope that includes the service worker, and then the browser will tell you whether you have a syntax error or not. So that's a little cheat you can do if you're just using the browser for development. Service worker does other things. It has other events. These two are particularly important if you're doing some smarts in your service worker, like auto updates and whatnot. The on install, this is when it is first installed. So this would be a great place to actually download all of the assets you have for your app. So download everything, cache everything, then you're good to go no matter what, if they're offline or whatever. On activate, I believe this one is on install as well, but this is more importantly when you're loading up your app for the first time, or maybe you haven't used the app for a while and the service worker got turned off, but then you start using it again. So then the activate command will be, or event will be fired. This is a great place to check for updates. If you are auto updating your, this would be a good place to do it, because it'll only get fired kind of when you have the ability to do something about it. Gotchas for the service worker. So this is more general. Updates to the worker are not instantly deployed to your user base. So if you have a large user base and you need to get them an update, know that that will not happen immediately unless you have got the service worker update stuff going that I talked about earlier. So you need to keep that in mind. Even if they download the new service worker, like I said, it will not take effect until they actually close the app. So if you are going to release a service worker to production, keep that in mind when you are doing it. Make sure that you're not going to have to push a new update right away because it just won't get in. There's no local storage for service workers. This can be a problem if you're trying to do some configuration in there. That's the way I've kind of done things in the past, and unfortunately, you cannot do that. But what you can do is you can actually cache resources instead, and it kind of gives you the same functionality as local storage, really, because you can go into a cache at any time. You don't have to do it just on a fetch request. You can go into the cache anytime and pull out anything you want. So it's actually a great place. You just cache the JSON instead of saving it to local storage or something like that. You can even create these resources locally within the service worker. You don't have to download them. A little bit more tricky that way, but as long as it is in a request and response object, you can shove that right in, dynamically generate the whole thing. The worker is not always running like we talked about, so if you're going to save a variable and rely on that, it will get erased, and you can't really control when that is, so do not rely on your variable long-term stuff that might be. And this is still cutting technology. The service workers work really well, but there are some things that don't work. I mentioned briefly messaging a specific client. So if there's multiple windows open, you cannot message a single one. Specifically, that functionality just isn't ready. It's in tech, but it's just not implemented in the browsers yet, unfortunately. But you can still message everybody. So make sure you're always checking for a feature before you're going to rely on it. It's very important. That was all great, but let's get to the real fun, push notifications. Push notifications really, for me, are that big deal that gets you that much closer to a native app experience. Anyone on a mobile device will have some kind of notification system. But in case you're not familiar with what they are, they're the pop-ups that show up on your phone. They are by far the most effective way to re-engage users with your app. It's a great way to little pop-up saying, hey, offer for you, or someone liked your post, or now or something. It's a great way. It's just so easy for people to click and get back into your app. Of course, if you do overuse them, you'll de-engage users and people will uninstall your app. So you got to be careful with it, but they're very, very valuable if done correctly. It's also nice too, you can give functionality to users without them actually having to open the app completely. They can just do a yes or a no response and so on, just them. So push for progressive web apps is a little different than native apps. In a lot of ways, it is easier because you don't need to register for a service. But the way it works is the web browser receives push instead and then sees that it is for your code and forwards it to your worker. So the service worker will receive the notification and will handle the display of it, and et cetera, et cetera. So you need to make sure your smarts are in the service worker because that's what gets run in the background, right? Your doesn't run in the background, it runs in the forefront to the user. So the service worker should, because you could do a little handshake between the service worker and your app, but it's best leave it all in the service worker so that it works as it's supposed to. Because local and server initiated notifications are supported. So you can just do local notifications, but you can also do the more typical ones where you have to send something from the server to trigger the notification. So here's a real kind of straightforward look at how it works. This is for the remote one. So the first thing that happens is your client needs to register for notifications. and I'm going to show you a little code on how to do that. And then your server has everything it needs, including the URL of the push service. So a browser may use any push service it wants, and you don't know what that is necessarily, but the good news is that all the information you need comes out of a registration in your client. So when your client registers for push notifications, you send all that data to your server, and then the server can dispatch push notifications whenever you need to. So highlights of the web push, in my opinion, is they're easier to implement than native push notifications. I have done push notifications on Apple and Android, and it was just annoying because they don't work the same on both, and getting it to work the same on both with my app, very, very frustrating. So this is a much easier way to do it because the browser really takes care of kind of native speak, so to speak. For you. It does all the hard work. So you just have this common API, and that's all you have to focus on. It doesn't matter which platform you're on. So a lot of headaches go away with push compared to a native push. Very similar features, especially since it should work the same as a native app. The push notification will come into the browser, which is a native, and then the browser can take the action of up your service worker and going from there. Now, keep in mind, this is new technology, as I've said, so be sure to test before relying upon it. I have not personally done web push notifications, so this is a little bit, you'll have to take my word for it. But based on what I've seen, it does look easier than native notifications. So you don't need a service account, so no Firebase Cloud Messenger needed, no sign up, whatever. It just works because the browser's done all the hard work for you. You need a public-private key pair on your server to make this work. Your service worker will need to be able to get the public. So a little bit of tricky stuff there. There are plenty of libraries. A quick Google search, and I've got some links coming up, but a quick Google search will show you plenty of libraries you can use in any language. So it looks like this is a pretty well supported feature. How well it works in a kind of progressive web app style as opposed to web app style, I'll leave you guys to discover that. But there's plenty of libraries to help you out, which is great. And as I said before, the browser receives the push notification, but everything you need with your subscription. So let's look at that a little bit. So this is the registration we saw earlier for your registering your service worker in the first place, the client. Notice we get a registration value back when the service worker is ready. So we earlier, and all we did was echo the scope out to the console. But in this case, we're actually taking the registration and subscribing it to push notification. Takeaway here is that you can see that there's a fetch of a public key, and that's the public key from your server. The public-private key pair basically tells the browser who you are when you're coming back, and also to you. So it's a security thing, and it helps the browser and the browser's push service make the connection back to you. There's a URL 64 function here that is not standard, and it is due to incomplete support for this in Chrome. So the URL here, and I'll reference this site later, but it is a fabulous site for giving you the basic details for push notifications and other service worker stuff. But basically, it's very simple from the client, right? This is all you have to do, and you're good to go. The service worker is even easier. All you have to do is say, hey, when I get a push notification, do some stuff. So this particular example isn't doing anything with the data that comes into the service worker. But you can see if you just wanted to test whether, like, what it looked like and maybe get the styling right, then you can see how easy it actually is. So as I said before, sadly, I did not have the time to actually get push notifications working on my demo apps before this session. But here's some really good some sites for it. I mentioned the libraries, so there's a PHP and a C# link here. I'm sure you have other languages that you maybe want to use, but a quick Google search will show up something. The key here is to call it web push. Because it isn't necessarily, I mean, it is a progressive web app thing, but because it uses a service worker, but you know, you don't need to implement other service worker functionality to do web push. You can simply use a service worker for web pushing and none of the caching stuff. That's a wrap, everybody. I hope you found it interesting. I find, like I said before, progressive web apps to be a very, very exciting technology, especially from a developer or a business standpoint, where you can just develop your app one time and you're done. You don't have to worry about other platforms. You don't have to worry about Play stores or app stores changing their guidelines. You just build your app one time and it works on laptops, Chromebooks, mobile phones from any manufacturer, and you're done. There's definitely a big push in it now, which I'm very excited about. They have been saying that for years. I mean, when the first iPhone came out, it was supposed to be web apps only, and that didn't work out. When the Chromebooks came out, you know, a lot of people said these are going to die, they're not going to go anywhere, but they've been around for years now and only getting more popular. I installed ChromeOS myself just on one of my existing computers, and actually it was pretty cool. It was really easy to do everything in it. There are some limitations as a developer, I find, but for normal clients who aren't doing that kind of work, it's really got everything you need in it. I have some helpful resources for you. A little shameless self-promotion. My website at the top. I am going to put a link to, actually it's already live, there's a link to the slideshow on the first article. You just go to that URL. And when Startup Slam publishes this presentation, I will add it there as well. There's plenty of links on my site and some of the articles to my GitHub, but there it is as well. Most important thing on there for you for now is I do have my service worker on my GitHub there, and it is nice because it handles auto update of your app. It's not polished by any means, but it does handle everything automatically. What it does is it relies on server code to scan your files for changes, and if it changes, it updates accordingly. That may be something of use, but there is some other useful sites here I want to just highlight. So this first one here is a great site for if you're having troubles between the service worker and your client app. That's a great URL for that. Is Service Worker Ready? Is a super helpful site because it's basically a feature list and talks about each of the features and whether it's supported or not on this browser or that browser. Mozilla Developer Network, if you're not using it yet, you should be. Even Google and Microsoft gave up and said they're going to start working on Mozilla's site. So really, if you need anything at all with web technologies, use it. And the last one, Service Work RS, which is actually Service Workers. If you take the dot out, it's a Mozilla site as well, and has plenty of examples of how to do all kinds of service worker stuff. So it is a super resource just for getting yourself started super quick. That is it. We 5 minutes before the end, but I'm willing to stay on longer. If anyone has any questions, now is the time. So yeah, fire away if you want. Okay, so I see here the first one, Tony. So glad you enjoyed it. Definitely, there's contact on my website if you have more questions afterwards. By the way, everybody, if feel free to email me through the website, and I'll email you back in person. So the question: some browsers auto detect a web app and recommend the user to install it. Yeah, okay. So I'll talk about that first. So if you are on a mobile device and I thought I had some slides for this. I didn't. So there is a manifest feature that you can add to your app, and it's basically a JSON file that has icons and has how your app is displayed, like in the background color, are a bunch of things. And I'm sorry, I should have added to the presentation. I'll make sure I add it to the presentation later. So check my website later next week, and it'll have the update in it. It's kind of a terrible name, the manifest, because of the app cache manifest. Whereas app cache manifest was actually a manifest. The manifest for progressive web apps is a manifest of installed kind of things. It has nothing to do with the functionality of your app. It's just a manifest installing. If you have a manifest, the browser should give you a little pop-up saying, hey, do you want to install this? It works on Chrome sometimes. On Firefox, it doesn't give you a but it does in the menu give you an install button. That seems to work every time on Firefox. Chrome is better on at least Android because it will install the app in the app area as opposed to just a backup on the home screen if you're on Android, which is better than just it being you want it in the, like I said, the first class area. So Chrome really is the best choice for now. But like I said, this technology is kind of evolving. The installing actually doesn't really work that great. Like I said, on Chrome, it doesn't always give you the install button. And on Firefox, it actually doesn't. When it opens, it works great, but it takes a few times pushing an icon for the browser to fully wake up, whereas it'll work perfectly fine if you load the site within your browser, but if you're loading it from an icon on your desktop or in your home screen on the mobile, it doesn't always load the app first time, which is a pain in the butt. So the install stuff is not really production ready, in my opinion, unless you're working really closely with a client, can walk through them, all the challenges. But your second part of the question, what are some things you can do for those that don't? I'm not sure you're going to be able to detect whether that's features available or not. My recommendation would be a pop that you hit the user with when they're first loading it to tell them to add it to their home screen thing. Maybe one of the on-before install events or something. You can do it with the service worker probably, because it's got the install event, and then you could tell the client, hey, I just got installed. Whereas that will only happen one time. But if they haven't actually added to their home screen, I don't think there's any way to detect whether that's actually happened or not. So even if they had added it to their home screen, you might be prompting your client to do that every time, or your user to do that every time when they've already done it. So be a little careful with that one. Write to Google, write to Mozilla, if you want anything like this, because it is still evolving, right? This is a feature a technology that is still evolving. I mean, the browsers have not implemented all the features. Service workers work great, and I think that's been the focus for the browsers, is to make sure those work well, and they do. I've tried it on a number of browsers, and they work great. It's kind of some of the ancillary stuff, like actually installing this as an app, a mark or something like that. Cool. Yeah, I can't hear you, Paul. I'm not sure what's going on. This may be a hop-in thing. They said that they support Firefox. Maybe they don't that well. But yeah, hey, thanks everyone for joining. And like I say, feel free to reach out through the contact page on my website, and I'll email you back if you have any questions.
Thanks, Dave.
Nice to see you, Mel. All right, there's no further questions. I'm going to sign off. Thanks, everybody, and spread the word about progressive web apps.